What's going on YouTube? This is Tapnuo, and I'm here today with a minimal techno tutorial breakdown of sorts. This is how I made the record I Saw an Alien in the Yucca Valley, which is track 1 off of my new album Fake Techno, which was released on February 18th. Shout out to everyone who's been showing love on the album, supporting the records. I'm really excited to share how I made this record with all of you, and I will be doing tutorials and breakdowns on pretty much all of the records on the album. So stay tuned for that. New videos here every single week. If you like minimal techno, consider hitting that subscribe button. It really helps out a lot. Anyways, let's break on into it. So this record started out with, of course, a kick drum. It kind of went through a couple different versions before the actual release. I have separate project files that are, like a V1, V2 of sorts. And it started out more progressive, honestly. This record is a little more of that rolling, syncopated, classic techno kind of sound. And it started out with almost like a guitar-sounding synthesizer running through a guitar amp. But then I actually trashed all of that, and I kept the drums. So what I started with for this would have to be the drums, and let's start out with just this kick drum. Now, all this kick drum it's the drum synth plugin in Logic. I should note that most of the time in the past, I have been using exclusively Pro Tools to make music, but on my computer that I have now, I have Logic, and years ago, I was using Logic, and I kind of have gotten back to that. I mixed this whole record as well as the entire album in Pro Tools on an API console. So a majority of what you're seeing today is just raw production, not really much mixing going on. Although I will say with the intention of choosing the right sounds. So I tried to minimize any, mix cleanup by selecting sounds that occupy a specific frequency range, and they're not fighting each other. They're only complementing each other. So that's the beauty of this kick drum plugin in Logic, is you can shape, design, affect your kick drum however you like, and I can keep it as MIDI so that as I'm listening to how the other drums interact with it, the toms, the hi-hats, so on and so forth, I can adjust the decay, I can adjust the snap. But yeah, it's very simple. It's just a 4 on the floor. Pretty soft kick, but it was beefed up a little bit in the studio with some analog gear. The next thing would be a tom. So same process. It's just the drum synth from the tom setting with adjustments made to the specifics, a little bit crusher, and I can turn that off and show you the difference. Barely in there. You'll notice it's only mixed in at 10%, but that's really all you need, because by the time you add further harmonics with analog equipment, you really start to notice those little changes that the bit crusher adds. So I'll play those together, and then it also has this rolling tom, which has been printed, and that actually came from, if I unhide some of these tracks, that came from another recording, and I'm going to keep it 100 with you guys. I don't straight up remember where that recording came from, but this is what I ended up with. Almost like a delayed tom that's rolling onto itself. So when you combine that with that other tom in the kick drum, you get this. And already you can hear that's that, classic chugga 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 kind of techno, especially considering that this track is at 127 beats per minute. That's a classic style already. So you really can't go wrong with a foundation like that. Next would be the hi-hats. Those are, really straightforward, just drawn in with MIDI using the Ultra Beat plugin in Logic. And I know that Logic, the newer versions of it, has incredible, alchemy and the drum synth stuff like that. But the classic Ultra Beat drum kit, I swear by that thing. It is incredible. You can adjust, the swing, you can adjust the velocity, you can right click and add different steps, shift steps around. And the stock sounds that it comes with are great. You can also replace the samples individually. So for the main hi-hat, I kind of have this stereo thing going on. I kept that one pretty wide because it's the main driving hi-hat, and it has a little more wiggle room to occupy frequency range. Now that's playing on top of this, which is less of a hi-hat. It's more of just a glitch sound that is coming also from the Ultra Beat with a the teeniest, tiniest amount of reverb. And it's just the stock Logic reverb. In this case, I inserted it directly onto the channel. I don't love the signal routing workflow in Logic. I much prefer how Pro Tools does that. So a lot of things like reverb and any sort of aux processing was done after these stems were printed out and brought onto the console. And I should note, even then, not really that much. I mean, we're talking just emphasizing what was already there. There's an additional hi-hat that comes in later on in the record, which is essentially just like a more shuffled hi-hat. Same technique, Ultra Beat, and just like barely a little EQ. And the velocity is changing, as well as there's I think in Ultra Beat, when I drew these in, there's a little bit of swing at like 60%. Swing is, very important for techno music, especially minimal techno. Some of the more driving warehouse techno, you see less swing because it's more on the grid. But this kind of stuff, you want to get it loose. And what I did with the clap, I think really emphasizes that sort of laid back, loose feel. So that's one thing I love about this track is the clap has this kind of laziness to it. And I'll actually play that alongside all of these so that you can hear the drums that we've just discussed so far. So those claps are, the first layers are coming from Ultra Beat, oddly enough, from the minimalistic kit. And then there's a little bit of a bit crusher, a little more processing than the other tom that I had, a little more mixed in. But if I take that bit crusher off versus, it's not really that crazy. More just for taste. I think also part of the reason I use this so much is I'm just so used to using it. You get kind of attached to specific plugins. And I think in order to maintain consistency in your sound, it's important to use the same plugins across projects. That doesn't mean you have to use the exact same plugins every single time. But if you're using, it's like if you're a chef and you're using similar ingredients and a similar technique, your food's going to taste consistent, versus like just every single time it's something different. Now, this other clap is a sample that I found from a website called freesound.org. And it occupies a much lower part of the frequency spectrum, which really complements that first clap layer. So after that, we have those drums laid down. We have a little bit of like a perk element. It's like an effect kind of thing. This, I believe, was from, let's see. That might be, so that's actually just from here, just from the Logic loop library. And it just fit the record, It didn't need too much processing. It just occupied the exact frequency range that I wanted, and it adds a little rhythm. And it plays really nicely alongside these other glitch kind of perk sounds. So let's hear those. Now on that one, you hear the big difference with the bit crusher. Sometimes the bit crusher is more to complement things, and sometimes it's more intentional, like we need to specifically tune the sound. And that's what that plugin is super powerful for. In this case, it's got a little more mix going on, but it plays really nicely with those existing drums. So let's go ahead and solo all of those. Yeah, and as you can see, I mean, these drums are what I started out with, and I was trying different melodies and stuff over them, and eventually I kept it way more stripped down, way more raw, which is something I really love about this record. Now, what I just brought in is there's another loop of sorts, texture kind of loop from freesound.org, which is something I just chopped up and kind of made it fit. And this one plays really nicely alongside this other one. I like how it has a little bit of like a vinyl kind of sound in it. It just adds some further character to the record. So additionally, to fill out the rhythmic parts of the record, I have some snare fills, which are very simple. We have that one, and we have this one. So where these came from is one of them came from the Logic Loop library, and I just found a specific part of it that I liked and trimmed it. Now, you'll see here, this other one came from MF Doom, and for any of my MF Doom fans out there, there's a track called Vomit, which I'm sure you all know about. I mean, a lot of people know Vomit Spit, but there's the original version of it is Vomit, and there's a cool remix by a group called 333 of that track, and that was actually a record I heard years and years ago that had these crazy drums on it, and it just stuck in my mind for a long time, and I've always wanted to use those drums in some capacity, and I never was able to make them fit correctly into a record. And then I finally had the idea to just trim a very small part of it and use it as like a turnaround. And that's it. Because if I go out, there's a lot more to those drums. Hang on. There's a lot more to those drums. It's like a classic breakbeat. But I just love how they sound, and they have such a like old school vibe to them that really fit this record, added a lot more character than just some, over processed, like overproduced, super clean drum sample from something like the Logic synthesizer. Sometimes sampling is a way to get sounds that you can't, like if you need like a dirtier sound, I would recommend to look for a sample instead of just producing something with a synthesizer or something like that. Of course, there's ways to dirty up existing sounds, but there's nothing better than finding, drums from a record that came out from 20 plus years ago and being able to repurpose those. And I think even in that record, those drums were repurposed. I will have to dig and find where those drums actually came from, but you know what I mean. So other than that, there's a little glitch kind of vocal sound. And if I unhide some of these, yeah, so let's pull this guy up. So yeah, there's some glitch Vox sample. There's a lot of hidden tracks in this because that's something I do in Pro Tools a lot too, is I'll make a track inactive if I'm just kind of playing around with something and I don't want to keep it in my view of the session. I don't love how Logic handles it, but I kind of just make it work. So those glitch Vox samples, they sound like this. And in this case, I actually printed that out. But if I unhide them, there's a tape delay, which is just a great stock Logic plugin, quarter note dotted, just a lot of feedback, keeps it going. And it's panned quite a bit. I think I panned it additionally upon, yeah, so I did that, and then I printed it and then added more stuff to it, such as a bit crusher, a little reverb just to kind of put it in its own space, and again inserting the reverb on the actual channel, not doing an auxiliary because it's an effect. It's not like a main part of the track, but it grabs the listener's ear. It stands out because it doesn't come in that often, and also I've noticed, especially on this album, using bit crusher stuff, it's a great way to get something to cut through the mix, cut through the noise. But yeah, so let's just solo what we have so far. Now, one thing I should note about these drums is there's ever so small instances in the record where things are kind of either muted or shifted around just to add some bounce. So like here I've just taken out the drums for one small part to add emphasis for some more glitch vocal samples, as well as for those snare fills to cut through. And then there's a couple parts where the kick drum doubles up and whatnot, but for the most part it's just a 4 on the floor. So that's actually something I forgot to mention that kind of plays off that more consistent glitch vocal is at only one point in the record, because I had it playing more in the beginning, and then I ended up muting it just for sake of arrangement purposes. But I have this vocal sample, which is just from the Logic loop library with some processing, similar processing to the other sample, just for sake of consistency. And then this is like a sound effect from the same loop library. Now, you don't really notice it when you're hearing the entire record, but it adds that emphasis kind of on the downbeat to signal to the listener that, another portion of the record is coming, because from here on out, it's starting to approach the mix out for a DJ where you would bring that next record in. It's kind of like a cue point almost. So, if you're DJing this record, that's a good time to instantly bring in another track, even if it's just a DJ tool or the hi-hats or, the beginning of it, so you can start to stitch together. And this track is something I kept rather quote unquote loopy to play in a DJ set. A lot of the approaches I've been taking lately have been with DJ sets in mind and making stuff that both I would like to DJ, but also other people can use as they please. You don't have to play the whole record. And that's kind of the beauty of techno music is you can layer in a kick drum, you can layer in a hi-hat, a vocal sample, and almost create an entire new record from other records. So it's, in a way, it's like sampling. But let's talk about this bass, because the bass is one of the standout points of the record. Kind of has an alien bug growl kind of vibe to it, at least in my opinion, and that's definitely where the inspiration of this record came from. I will actually leave my Alien Experience video in the description so you can kind of have some further context for people who are new to the channel. But I did see an alien in the Yucca Valley, or it was something that wasn't from this earth. I don't know if it was an alien or a ghost or whatever, but to me it felt more alien, and it had like this pulsating vibe, and I wanted to really capture that on this record by having a bass that stays very consistent, doesn't move around too much, just pulses in and out. And you can even see that on the waveform where it doesn't hold too much. It kind of comes in, comes out, and that really adds a nice push-pull with the existing clap, those kind of lazy claps that are playing on the record. So let's hear the final version of it. So it's actually very simple how this bass was made, and I kept the previous prints of it visible in the session, so it can kind of further be explained of how we got to the final version. But it's really simple. I mean, it's honestly just one note playing over and over and over at different intervals. I think it's playing, if I remember, what is that, like quarter notes, dotted quarter notes. It's been a minute since I've opened this project, but what it is, it's Alchemy, the stock Logic synth. I was going through different just presets and settings, and I came across this 808 setting that had, an additional adjustment called wide growl to it. I started with that, and I can actually take off all of the processing on there so we can just hear it how it was raw. Make sure, It's at that stage, it's kind of boring. But I heard you have to, when you're producing techno or any style of music, you kind of have to be thinking a couple steps ahead. And I knew that this was a great starting point because I wanted something wide. I wanted something that was going to cut through the mix, but at the same time not be obnoxious. So I just started out by cutting out the lows. That's, that's like stuff that the kick drum and all of those rolling toms are going to occupy. And then once you have additional harmonics brought in from analog gear, that frequency range is going to be just fine. So I took that out. I added the fat effects, which is just another stock Logic plugin. And so let's hear what that sounds like. Quite a bit of automation, if I can expand that. Yeah. So you'll see here, there's a lot of automation going on. I don't remember how to make it visible, but yeah, there's tons of automation going on, and it's just different things, different plugins being modified to create a lot of movement to give it a much more alive sound. I got to be honest with you, Logic is not my main DAW. I honestly hate this program, but I love some of the results that you're able to get out of it, and I'm just going off the dome here, so bear with me. But the next plugin that I threw on is a very similar plugin. It's so similar to the fat effects, the step effects, which is kind of, I guess, comparable to something like Filter Freak. And that is the plugin that really, when I was initially adding that Alchemy preset, I was trying to get to this point, to have like a really distorted, blown out, almost like a guitar pedal kind of sound. So that is being automated, as well as there's another EQ just boosting the mids. And I just, for shits and giggles, cut off the lows again, because adding distortion like that can add further harmonics that you might not necessarily want. Now, a lot of the automation too is also coming from this remix effects plugin. Is stuff that I just, as the record was playing, as those drums were playing, I just went through and manually did that and did, what's it called? Touch automation. Touch automation is great to give it a more live feel. In the past, I used to draw in and just look at it, but now I have moved towards just feeling it. It's much better to go by feel when you're doing this kind of stuff because it can sound stiff. I think some of my previous records, there's a little bit of a stiffness to them because I was so focused on how it looks instead of how it sounds. And that's number one. That's like one of the most important things to remember is it's all about how it sounds. It just because you're seeing it on the DAW screen doesn't mean that people on the dance floor have that same perspective. Next is Space Designer, which is, again, just inserted on the channel. That's kind of how I like to do things in Logic, especially because you have a wet and dry, and the wet is pretty low on here. So it just sends it slightly back in the mix. The Space Designer plugin specifically is great for doing that. If you have something that you want to keep it forward, but you don't want to keep it so forward that it's like distracting to the listener. And then also when you do something like Space Designer or add just a little tiny bit of reverb to the sound, it tucks in the sound a lot better to the record as opposed to just like standing dry on its own and not really, it gives the sound context in the case of like the rest of the drums. So the last thing we have for that first round of it is another EQ taking out a very specific frequency and then a limiter just to prevent any peaks, because there was like one point where it got pretty dynamic and I just wanted to tame it a little bit. So I'll go ahead and turn that off. I then printed that into here. And so what you're seeing here, this first waveform is just the waveform from the MIDI from this. Oh, this does not have an output. Let's put that to an output. So that one, I was pretty happy with how that sounded. And then here I printed it again, just added a little bit more of the step effects, which if I open the automation, I don't remember if I have automation on that. No, it's just adding I'm pretty sure what I did on that is I'm just adding the reverb from needs an output. Yeah, so in Logic, there's all these different kinds of reverb, but I've noticed that the step effects plate reverb, there's like all these different types of reverb in this plugin. I don't know what's going on with them, but they have way better algorithms, way better sounds than even like Space Designer, impulse reverb or impulse response reverb or whatever the other reverb settings are reverb plugins in Logic. I love how this stuff sounds, to the point where on other projects, I'll actually just like turn everything off about this plugin and just use the reverb, because especially when you automate it, you can get these cool, really like quick, expansive, dramatic reverbs that they cut through the mix in a way that a reverb on an aux would not. So have that, and then just shaving more of the lows off to prevent muddiness. And then I printed that into here, and then just tuned down some very specific frequencies. And from there, it was just emphasizing what I had laid down in Logic by, mixing it analog in Pro Tools in the studio. So the last part of the record the last two parts of the record would be this kind of like acid bass line, I guess. And I'm not even going to cap on this. It's literally just a loop from Logic. I was actually almost done with the record, and I felt it needed something additional. And I tried my modular synthesizer. I tried different plugins. I tried writing different melodies and whatnot, and nothing was working. And then I was just browsing through the loop library in Logic, and it fit the record perfectly. It fit the key. It fit the tone. It fit the kind of almost goofiness that I was trying to go for. And it was one of those things where I was like, what's stopping me from adding this in? I don't see the problem here. Like, yes, I mean, you shouldn't make an entire record out of loops, but like the stock Logic loops are there for a reason, and they're tools. They're not meant to be, just an entire sound pack, but they are very helpful for when you're trying to find that little last piece of sauce or something, you know what I mean? Just trying to add something. So, and then additionally from the Logic sample library was this cricket sound. And I don't know why they put it in like Atmos or binaural kind of setting. It had this weird like 3D sound to it that I don't want to do on my music. I'm not into that kind of stuff. I think Atmos is better off in the film world. At my day job specifically, because I work as an audio editor for television shows, and Atmos and for movies and stuff is great when you have picture to match it. But in this case, it's just cricket noise in the background. It didn't need to be, this crazy 3D sound. So what I did, I just folded it down to stereo and then manually automated the volume to give it that sort of realistic outside sound. And I added this as well because when I had that experience seeing the alien in Yucca Valley, there were a lot of bugs around. There weren't actually any crickets around, but it just had that, it gave it that kind of like campsite vibe that I was going for. Yeah, and as I zoom back out, you can see the intense layers of automation on this first round of the bass. And that's really where the character came from, is doing pass after pass after pass of just manually, in touch mode or in latch mode, drawing in the automation, not to the grid. That's also something I was happy with how this came out, is it has a little bit of a loose vibe to it. Yeah. And so if I just play the whole thing. Now on here, the mix does sound a little different, but I don't think it sounds horrible. The thing that I was going for was just trying to have a really solid foundation. And I think a lot of producers get stuck in thinking that they have to, like, just because they have a sound in their project, they're not like quote unquote real producing unless they have like a million plugins on it. And honestly, sound choice, sound selection is so much more important than just like flexing your technical knowledge. Because at the end of the day, it's music. It's the people who are listening to it on the dance floor, in their car, wherever. They don't have the same perspective of seeing how the record was made. And to be honest, they don't care. They just want to hear the music. They just want to feel the music. And it's so important to feel the music and not get caught up in like how it looks, in terms of like how another producer is going to judge you when you're making it. And because honestly, I've done records that are 100 times more complicated production wise than this one. And I actually prefer this to some of those. Like there's a record I put out in 2020 called Shroom, which is this like, flexing my production muscles, kind of like very technical, like took all these crazy approaches to it. But musically it's interesting, but it's not like memorable, And I think this is a track that is a much more simple approach, but a much more effective approach. And in years to come, I'll be able to still play this record. I'll still be able to go back to this record. I'm very proud of this, and I'm very proud to share how I made it with all of you guys. So consider hitting the thumbs up button. Consider subscribing. New videos here every single Thursday, and I will be doing further breakdowns on how I made Fake Techno. Thank you.